Hey everyone! In this video we're going to talk about intercepts of functions, specifically X and Y intercepts, which we'll talk about from both graphs and equations. I want to start with a context of where this might matter. So let's say you have a car and you're going on a trip. You have a full tank of gas. This equation here is going to tell us how much gas is left in the tank after the car has driven a certain amount of miles, relating X to Y. Okay. So in order to get a visual of what this looks like, we're going to graph the equation on the grid and then talk about what we see. I'm going to see what you remember about graphing on your own first. So see if you can graph this. A couple of hints, if you're not sure where to begin, you could just make a table, plug in things for X, find the corresponding Y. Or you might recognize that this is a linear equation in the form y equals mx plus b, although it's reversed here. So either way, try to graph this on your own. Okay, looking at this graph that I'm going to use here, let's call the x-axis the distance you travel in miles, and the y-axis how many gallons are remaining in the tank, right? Just like the directions say. So x is miles, y is gallons. See if you can sketch that graph. Take a moment. I'll come back. Okay, in my work, you will see that in order to graph, I made a table here. And I chose different X values based on what was labeled on the graph here, just to kind of make it easier. It kind of told me the increments just by looking at the axes. And I plugged those different values in for X here and found the corresponding Y value by doing 16 minus 0.05 times each of these X values. Okay, don't worry too much about the graphing because we have an entire unit on graphing lines, but that's just a little preview here. Okay, either you got something that looks like my graph or you should be sketching your own right now. And by the way, it makes sense that it's linear because it's y equals mx plus b. Our slope is negative, so it's decreasing. Anyways, that's for another unit, but just thought I would mention. What the real point of this is I want to talk about intercepts. Okay, specifically starting with what are the x and y intercepts and what do they tell us about the situation? Because I know you're all asking, why do I care? And hopefully I can answer that for you as well. Okay. Let's start with what is an x-intercept and what is a y-intercept. Visually, an x-intercept is where the graph crosses the x-axis. That's visually. Crosses or touches, whatever you want to say, the x-axis. Which means a y-intercept then is where the graph crosses the y-axis. Make sure you have these notes written down. Find both of these points on the graph here. So first, x-intercept, let's look at the x-axis and figure out where our graph is touching, which would be right here. Okay, to list our x-intercept for this particular graph, so we'll start with x-intercept. I'll list that as a point because the x-intercept is the point where it touches. Okay, so first you always list your x-coordinate. So how far did we move on the x-axis? Is 320, which would technically be miles. Okay, then the y-coordinate of this, well, it's not moving up or down at all, so the y-coordinate is 0. Okay, so that's the x-intercept because that's where it touches the x-axis. And since it's on the x-axis, all x-intercepts will not move up or down from it at all, which means your y-coordinate is always going to be 0. Okay, another note to put on this x-intercept list. The y-coordinate of an x-intercept will always be 0. That's going to be super important throughout this class. Let's go ahead and find the y-intercept now. So for the y-intercept, we're going to look at where our graph crosses the y-axis, which is right here. And to list the y-intercept of the graph, I'm going to list it as a point. Okay, so the x this time is going to be 0 because you're not moving left or right at all on the yellow axis here. You're only moving up 16 units. Okay, so therefore the y-intercept is going to be the point 0, 16. And for every y-intercept, the x-coordinate will always be 0 because you're not moving left or right at all. You're staying on that axis. So we're going to add that to our list here. For the y-intercept, the x-coordinate will always be 0. And then you see this third word here, which is zeros. This is just some language that we need to know for this class. Zero is another word for an X-intercept. Okay, oftentimes we will call them zeros instead of X-intercepts, so start studying now. You should relate those two words. They mean the same thing. Okay, we can also write our X and Y-intercepts as a value. So the X-intercept would be where X is equal to 320, that's where it's located. The Y-intercept would be at Y equals 16, which is where the Y-intercept's located. Okay, and what do they represent in the context is one of the more important questions. Why does this even matter? Because those are two very special points. So remembering the context is you're driving and you start with 16 gallons right here. Okay, and then as you're driving, okay, so you're driving some miles. So here you're at 160 miles, then you're at 240 miles. What's happening to your gas as your time and distance are going up? Well, your gas is going down as your miles are going up. And that's what's represented in this graph here. Okay, so the Y-intercept, what it represents in context is, I don't know, I like to call it your starting point, which makes sense because that's where you start graphing as well. And specifically to this context, it's how many gallons you start with. Gallons in the tank before you start driving. Gallons in tank at 0 miles. Just to kind of emphasize that, again, the x-coordinate is 0. That's what the Y-intercept is. What's the X-intercept? So you're driving, you're going more miles, and then what happens to your gas remaining? Oh, well, your Y-coordinate is 0, so you have 0 gallons remaining. This is where you run out of gas. Or you have driven 320 miles, and you have 0 gallons left. Okay, so often the X and Y-intercept actually tell you a lot about the graph. Different contexts will come up, different shapes of graphs will come up, but they're usually two really important points. Okay, interesting question, just to tie into what we've been doing already. I'm going to have you try this one on your own. Look at this graph here. I want you to tell me what a reasonable domain and range for the graph will be, and you can use interval notation for your answers. I'm going to pause the video, see what you can come up with. This is what you should come up with. Starting with domain, the lowest miles you can be is 0 because you can't have negative miles. The highest is how far we drove because after 320 miles, you ran out of gas. Now range, you can have 0 gallons, that's the lowest, you can't have negative gallons, and the highest is 16 because that's what the tank can hold. So I'm not going to talk too much more about that, but if you have questions, please do let me know. Okay, now it's not always going to be in a context, but all graphs can represent context. So let's just try an example where you are not in a scenario like a car. Let's say you have the absolute value function, absolute value of x minus 3. So again, these bars mean absolute value. Absolute value, long story short, makes all numbers positive because it measures the distance from 0 on the number line. So if I take the absolute value of 5, it's equal to 5. Absolute value of negative 5 is also equal to 5. That may be helpful when you're finding your x and y intercepts. Okay, so remember, starting with the x-intercept, okay, we learned above that the x-intercept will always have a y-coordinate of 0. So at the x-intercept, your y value is going to be 0, and at the y-intercept, your x value is going to be 0. And maybe I should be more specific that this is how I'm going to find the x-intercept, this is how I'm going to find the y-intercept. Okay, so x-intercept is going to be when y equals 0, so we're going to take y and plug 0 in for it, and that will help us find the x-intercept. Okay, so we don't have a graph this time, but you can use the equation when you know something about what the x-intercept means. In order to solve this equation, we need to isolate x. So we're going to add 3 to both sides. Just kind of come up here because I'm running out of room. So that would give you 3 equals the absolute value of x. Okay, so this one I want you to just think through. What numbers, when you plug them in here, will give you an output of 3? What can x equal? Okay, well, we know when we take the absolute value of 3, that's equal to 3, because 3 is 3 units away from 0 on the number line. And also, when you take the absolute value of negative 3, the absolute value of negative 3 is going to also equal positive 3. So there are 2 different places that will work for this x-intercept, which you can write as x equals 3 and x equals negative 3, or these both represent 2 different points where this graph touches the x-axis, which, just to sketch a little graph of what that would look like, the absolute value graph will look something like this, and it's going to have two places where you touch the x-axis, so that makes sense. These would be your x-intercepts. And that's actually the harder one to find. The y-intercept's a little bit easier because you're plugging in for x. So the y-intercept is where x is equal to 0. So I'm going to take that and plug it in for x in my equation. Sorry, I ran out of room. Just going to come down here. So to find the y-intercepts, you plug in 0 is x. Okay, absolute value of 0 is 0. Minus 3 is negative 3. So that means your y-coordinate of your y-intercept is negative 3, which you can write as a point is 0, comma, negative 3, where again, the x value of y-intercept is always 0. That's the point on the graph where it would touch the y-axis, okay, which would be like right here if you were looking at this graph. Cool. We could talk about domain and range. If you want to try those on your own, feel free to ask me questions. But the main point of this video was what are x-intercepts, what are y-intercepts, and what are zeros. And that's pretty much all I have for you today. So if you have any questions or you're wondering about any other context, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.